He had buried 3 good horses, 1 bad marriage proposal, and every reason left to trust a living soul. All before the summer, he rode into Clover Creek with $40 in his pocket and a name nobody recognized. If you're new here, please subscribe and hit that bell so you never miss a story. Drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The horse needed water before he did. That was the first thing Ethan Callahan decided when he rode into Clover Creek, New Mexico on a Tuesday morning in July of 1887. The sun was already a punishment at 8:30. Heat came off the packed dirt road in slow rolling waves, and the town that stretched out before him, 24 buildings, a water trough, a general store with a faded awning, looked like it had been arguing with the desert for 30 years and was finally starting to lose. He pulled Cinder to a stop at the trough outside the livery and stepped down slow, the way a man does when his back has been carrying something heavier than a saddle. He wore a canvas work shirt, sun-bleached, nearly white across the shoulders. His boots were cracked at the right heel. His hat had a sweat-stained band and a dent on the left side that had never fully come back out. He looked to anyone passing like exactly what he wanted to look like. Nobody. He let Cinder drink and stood beside her, one hand resting easy on her neck, watching the town move around him. A woman in a gray dress crossed the street without looking up. 2 men outside the barbershop glanced at him the way men in small towns glance at strangers, long enough to assess, short enough to dismiss. A boy of maybe 10 chased a chicken between the buildings and paid him no mind at all. Good, Ethan thought. That was exactly right. He had left Callahan Mountain Ranch 11 days ago. Left behind the foreman, the ledgers, the 2 ranch hands who'd been with him 6 years, and the reputation that preceded him into every room he'd ever walked into for the last decade. He'd left behind the lawyers who wrote his contracts, and the bankers who shook his hand too hard, and the women who smiled at him differently once they learned his name. He had not told a single person where he was going. He tied Cinder's lead loosely and walked toward the general store. A bell above the door announced him. Inside, a man in his 50s with a gray mustache stood behind the counter tallying figures in a ledger. He looked up, took in the state of Ethan's clothes, and his expression settled into the particular brand of polite disinterest that storekeepers reserve for customers they don't expect to spend much. "Help you," the man said. "Looking for work?" Ethan said. "Anything in the area need doing. Ranch labor, fence repair, horse care. I'm good with horses." The storekeeper, whose name Ethan would later learn was Earl Briggs, set down his pencil. "You got experience?" "Enough." "References?" "None I can give you today." Earl looked at him a moment. "Town's not exactly flush with opportunity. Most of the smaller operations around here are struggling. Big money's all tied up with Harrington." "Victor Harrington." Earl's expression shifted slightly. "You know him." "Heard the name?" Ethan said. Which was true. Victor Harrington owned 40,000 acres east of Clover Creek. He also held paper on half the smaller ranches within 30 miles. Ethan had made it his business to know that before he'd ever saddled Cinder. "Well." Earl picked up his pencil again. "The Whitmore place is about 4 miles north. Gerald Whitmore runs it. Struggling bad this season. Lost 2 ranch hands last month. Might take on somebody willing to work cheap." He paused. "Real cheap." "That suits me," Ethan said. Earl looked at him again, longer this time. "What did you say your name was?" "Thomas," Ethan said. "Thomas Greyhorse." Mahosung. The Whitmore Ranch sat on a flat stretch of land at the foot of a long ridge, the kind of place that might have been beautiful once if someone had bothered to love it. The fencing along the road needed replacing in 4 different sections. The main barn door hung at an angle. The water pump near the house had a handle wrapped in old cloth, the kind of fix a man makes when he doesn't have the money for a proper repair. Ethan took all of it in as he rode up the main track and said nothing. A man came out of the house before he reached the yard. Gerald Whitmore was somewhere around 55, heavyset, with the red face of someone who drank more than he ate, and a way of standing with his chest forward that communicated authority he no longer entirely possessed. He wore suspenders over a work shirt and held a coffee cup like a weapon. "What do you want?" Gerald said. "Work?" Ethan said, stepping down from Cinder. Earl Briggs in town mentioned you might need a hand. Gerald looked him over. Earl talks too much. He squinted at Ethan. You any good? I'm good with horses, good with fences. I can run a pump repair. I work hard and I don't cause problems. What do you want for wages? Ethan named a figure that was about a third of what he would have paid a man at Callahan Ranch. Gerald's eyes narrowed, and Ethan could see him calculating. Could see the moment the math won out over his pride. You got somewhere to stay? Not yet. There's a room in the bunkhouse. One other hand uses it, boy named Clem. He won't bother you. Gerald took a long drink of his coffee. You start tomorrow, first light. Don't be late. Yes, sir, Ethan said. Gerald was already turning back toward the house when Ethan heard it. From somewhere around the side of the barn, a sound so small he almost missed it. Not crying, not exactly. More like the sound a person makes when they've trained themselves not to cry out loud, and the effort has started to cost them something. He turned. She was kneeling beside the fence line along the eastern side of the barn, both hands working at a section of broken rail. The wood was old, and the wire had pulled loose, and she was trying to hold the whole thing together with her bare hands and a length of cord she'd been retying for what looked like the third or fourth time. Her dress was dark with sweat along the back. Her hair had come half loose from its pins. She didn't look up. Gerald had already gone inside the screen door, banging behind him. Ethan watched her for a moment. She got the cord around the post and pulled it tight, testing it with both hands. It held for about 2 seconds before the rail shifted and the whole section sagged again. She let out a single sharp breath through her nose. Not a curse, not a sob, just the sound of someone absorbing one more thing going wrong. You want a hand with that? Ethan said. She looked up then. She had gray eyes. He noticed that first gray eyes in a sun-browned face, the kind of eyes that had been watching things carefully for a long time. She was maybe 25, 26. Her expression when she looked at him was not embarrassment at being seen struggling, and it was not relief at the offer of help. It was the careful measuring look of someone who had learned that offers of help sometimes came with prices she couldn't afford. I can manage, she said. I can see that, Ethan said. I'm going to help anyway if that's all right. She sat back on her heels and watched him come forward. He crouched beside the fence, looked at the post, looked at the rail. The problem wasn't the cord. The problem was the post had rotted at the base and needed to be reset, or the whole section would keep failing no matter how many times she retied it. Posts rotted, he said. I know. Need to reset it, or you'll be tying that cord every other day. I know that too, she said. There's no spare lumber. He looked at her. She looked back at him, and in that moment, something passed between them that Ethan recognized, the particular dignity of a person who is fully aware of their situation and does not need it explained to them. Fair enough, he said. He picked up the cord, retied it in a different configuration, one that distributed the tension across 3 points instead of 2. Not a fix, but better than what she'd had. That'll hold a few more days. Give you time to source the lumber. She watched his hands while he worked. You're the new hand, she said. Yes, ma'am. Thomas Greyhorse. Clara Whitmore. He registered the name, same as Gerald's. His daughter. Something moved across her face. Stepdaughter, she said. He married my mother 8 years ago. A pause. My mother passed 2 years back. Ethan said nothing to that. He finished with the cord and stood, and she stood too, brushing the dirt from her skirt in quick, practical motions. Thank you, she said. And then, as though she'd made some internal decision, don't let him see you doing that. Doing what? Helping me? Her voice was matter-of-fact, not bitter. He doesn't like it when people treat me like I'm worth helping. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. She had already turned back toward the barn, walking with the steady, economical stride of someone who had somewhere to be and intended to be there. He didn't say anything, but he thought there it is. The bunkhouse was exactly what it looked like from the outside, 4 walls, 2 narrow bunks, and a window that let in more heat than light. Clem, the other hand, was a lean 18-year-old with a sunburned neck and the quality of someone who had learned early in life to take up as little space as possible. He nodded at Ethan when he came in, moved his boots off the lower bunk, and went back to mending a saddle strap without another word. Ethan lay on the bunk that night and stared at the ceiling and thought about what he was doing. He had a way of doing this, of holding a decision up to the light and examining it the way he'd examine a piece of leather for hidden cracks. Back at Callahan Ranch, he'd made hundreds of decisions about land and livestock and money and men, and he'd made them cleanly without much second-guessing. He trusted his own judgment in those things. This was different. This had started 3 months ago, at a dinner in Santa Fe, at a table full of people who were supposed to be his friends. A woman named Catherine, who had been writing him letters for 6 months, had been seated beside him, and she was charming and beautiful and said all the right things. He had started to think that evening that maybe he had been wrong about people, that maybe the loneliness he'd carried for the better part of a decade was just stubbornness on his part, a wall he'd built too high. Then he'd overheard her in the hallway after dinner talking to her friend. "He's so dull," she'd said, "but the land alone is worth $200,000. I can manage dull." He'd stood very still in that hallway for a long time. Then he'd gone back to the table and been perfectly pleasant for the rest of the evening, and the next morning he'd started making plans. He needed to know. That was all. He needed to know if there was such a thing as a person who would look at him, at the man himself, stripped of the land and the money and the name, and find something worth staying for. So far, the answer had been a consistent and resounding silence. He thought about Clara Whitmore kneeling in the dirt beside the fence, retying the same cord for the 4th time, with the patient focus of someone who had learned that no one was coming to fix things for her. Don't let him see you doing that. He had been in this town for 6 hours and had already met 2 people, the kind you meet and immediately know something true about. Gerald Whitmore was a man who had once had more than he did now, and had decided that the loss of that was someone else's fault. Clara was a woman who had been handed that blame so many times, she'd started to wonder if they were right. He'd known people like Gerald his whole life. He had never met anyone quite like Clara. Gotcha. Morning came in hard and orange through the bunkhouse window. Ethan was up before the light changed fully habit from 20 years of early ranch mornings. Clem was already awake, pulling on his boots. "What needs doing first?" Ethan asked. "Gerald wants the south pasture fence checked before 7. Then the horses, there's 8 of them. 3 need their shoes looked at. Clara usually does the feeding, but—" Clem stopped. "But—" The boy was quiet for a moment. "Gerald's been in a mood, bad one. You'll see." Ethan came out into the yard, and the heat was already building even before the sun had fully cleared the ridge. Gerald was standing by the barn talking to a man on horseback. A tall man in good clothes, the kind of good that wasn't trying to look good because it didn't have to. He sat his horse the way wealthy men sit horses, like the animal exists to carry him, and that's the full extent of the relationship. Ethan recognized the type before he recognized the face. But he recognized the face, too, from a photograph he'd seen in a newspaper 2 years back. Victor Harrington. He was maybe 60, with white hair combed back under a clean hat, and the kind of easy, practiced authority that powerful men develop over decades of being listened to. He was talking to Gerald in a low, pleasant voice, and Gerald was nodding in the way a man nods when he's trying to look like he's agreeing rather than surrendering. Ethan kept his head down and went to the south fence. But he listened. "The note comes due in October, Gerald," Victor was saying. "I've been very patient. You know that." "I know it," Gerald said. "I just need another season." "You said that last season." A pause. "I know. I'm not an unreasonable man." Victor's tone was pleasant. The pleasantness of someone who has already won and is now simply documenting it. "I've been thinking about a way we might resolve this that works for everyone." "What kind of way?" "My son William is 32 years old and still unmarried." Another pause, easy and unhurried. Your stepdaughter is a young woman in need of a good situation." The silence that followed was the loudest thing Ethan had heard in weeks. "She'd be well provided for," Victor continued. "William has his own household. She wouldn't want for anything." Gerald said slowly, "And the note. A marriage in the family changes things considerably. We might find it in everyone's interest to renegotiate." "I'd have to talk to her." "Of course," Victor said warmly. "Take your time. I just ask that you be practical about it, Gerald. It's a good offer for a girl in her position." Then Harrington's horse turned, and he rode back down the track unhurried, as though he'd just concluded a very satisfactory transaction. Ethan stood at the south fence with his hands still. A girl in her position. He knew what that meant. He had heard that language his whole life in the mouths of men who had decided that other people's desperation was a negotiating tool. A girl in her position. A girl with no money, no father by blood, no mother left to defend her, and a stepfather who had just sat quietly while another man discussed selling her future like it was acreage. He pulled a fence post out of the ground and reset it without thinking about it. The physical work moving through his hands while his mind worked on something else entirely. He thought, "I need to understand what is happening here before anything else." Clara was in the barn when he came back at mid-morning, brushing down a roan mare with the steady, concentrated attention she seemed to give everything. She didn't hear him come in. He watched her for a moment, not intrusively, just long enough to see how she moved when no one was watching. She moved like someone at rest, like this was the one place in the world where she forgot to hold herself braced. "She's a good horse," he said. Clara turned. She had a smear of dust on her cheek, and she'd repinned her hair since the morning, but some of it was already coming loose again. "She's the best one we've got," she said. "Her name's June." Good name for a summer horse. Clara almost smiled. Almost. "How was the south fence?" "Reset 2 posts. Third one needs a new section of rail. I'll see if there's scrap lumber in the barn." He came further inside and leaned against the stall door. "How long has the place been in trouble?" She was quiet for a moment, deciding something. Then, "Since my mother died. Gerald always needed managing, but my mother could manage him. After she was gone..." She brushed a section of June's shoulder with more attention than it needed. "Things got harder. Harrington's holding the note." She looked at him sharply. "You know about that. Heard it this morning." Her expression went careful. "You were listening." "I was working 20 feet away," he said. "Hard not to hear." Clara looked back at June. The brush moved in long strokes. "He's been after this land for 2 years. Gerald keeps thinking he can pull the ranch back before October. But..." She stopped. "But the numbers don't work." She said it flatly without drama. "I've looked at the books. The numbers don't work. Even a good summer won't be enough." Ethan said nothing for a moment. He was looking at her profile, the set of her jaw, the way she was holding the brush a little too tightly. "Harrington came this morning with a different kind of offer," he said carefully. She went still. "His son," Ethan said. The brush stopped moving. Clara stood with her back to him and her hand on June's flank, and she didn't say anything for a long count of 5. "William Harrington," she said finally. The words came out very even, very controlled. "Yes." Gerald agreed. "He said he'd talk to you." She turned around then, and Ethan looked at her face. There was no surprise there. That was the thing that hit him hardest. There was no surprise at all. There was only a kind of deep, exhausted recognition, the expression of someone encountering a thing they had already imagined and hoped wouldn't come. "He won't need to," she said. "I already know what Gerald will decide." "What will he decide?" Her eyes met his, and in them, Ethan saw something that he recognized, the way you recognize a landscape you've studied from a map, the long internal distance of a person who has spent years alone inside their own life. "He'll decide," she said quietly, "that I'm the most useful thing he's got left." She turned back to June and resumed brushing, and the steady sound of it filled the barn, And Ethan stood there and thought about that sentence and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not pity. He was careful to know the difference. Something more like recognition. He went back to work. That was the thing he did with feelings he wasn't ready to have yet. He worked. He pulled the third post, found 2 lengths of scrap rail behind the barn that would do for the section, and spent the better part of 2 hours resetting the south fence line properly for the first time in what looked like 3 seasons. Clem came by midday and watched him for a while without speaking, which Ethan had already come to understand was Clem's form of approval. Gerald came out once. He looked at the work, looked at Ethan and said nothing, just nodded and went back inside. At midday, Clara brought water out in a tin bucket with a ladle. She brought it to Clem first, and then she crossed to where Ethan was working and held out the ladle without ceremony. "Thank you," Ethan said. She nodded. She was about to leave when he said, "You eat this morning." She paused. "Why? You brought water out for both of us. I was wondering if you'd had anything yourself." She looked at him with that measuring look again. "I'm fine." That wasn't the question. Something very small and very controlled flickered across her face. "I had coffee," she said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." And then she left, taking the bucket back toward the house. He watched her go. Clem appeared at his elbow. "She does that," the boy said quietly. "Feeds everyone else first. Horses the hands Gerald. She eats last. Sometimes." He stopped. "Sometimes what?" Clem scuffed his boot in the dirt. "Sometimes there ain't much left." Ethan went back to the fence post and drove it into the ground with 3 solid strikes of the mallet, harder than he needed to. That evening, after the day's work was done and the horses were settled, Ethan sat on the bunkhouse step and listened to the ranch go quiet around him. The sun was going down behind the ridge, and the air had finally started to cool, and somewhere in the main house a lamp came on in a window. He could see Clara's silhouette through the glass. She was standing at a table, and she was still working. He watched the shadow of her move, reaching, stacking putting things in order. The same practical, quiet industry she brought to everything. Gerald's silhouette appeared in another window, then went still, then disappeared. Then, faintly through the summer air, he heard Gerald's voice. Couldn't hear the words, just the tone of it. The particular tone of a man who has already decided something and is telling someone else about it in the way that closes off argument. And then silence. And then nothing. The lamp in Clara's window stayed on for a long time after Gerald's went out. Ethan sat on the step and thought about the life he'd left behind on Callahan Mountain Ranch. The house with its good furniture and its view of the high pastures. The ledgers he knew like his own breathing. The foreman, old Henry, who'd been with him since the beginning and called him boss without any of the edges that word could carry. He had walked away from all of it to find out if there was a single person alive who would treat him decently when he appeared to have nothing worth having. 11 days in, he had his answer about most people. Earl at the general store politely dismissive. Gerald willing to take his labor at cut-rate wages without a moment's consideration of the man providing it. Victor Harrington sitting his expensive horse and speaking about a young woman's future the way you'd discuss the disposition of livestock. And then Clara, who had looked at his offer of help with clear-eyed caution rather than grasping relief. Who had told him flatly that she'd looked at the books and the numbers didn't work. Who had said, "I'm the most useful thing he's got left," in a voice stripped of self-pity, because she was describing a truth she had had time to acquaint herself with, not a fresh wound. He didn't know what to make of her yet. That was honest, but he knew that he wanted to. He went inside when the stars came out and lay on his bunk and thought one more day. That was always how he did it. One more day. Decide at the end of each one whether there's a reason to stay until the next. He thought about the sound of her hand on the fence post. The way she'd said June's name when she was talking about the roan mare with the particular warmth people reserve for creatures that have never disappointed them. One more day, he thought. And slept. He was at the water pump before 6 the next morning, working the handle to test the repair. The cloth wrapping had been replaced recently. Clara's work, he guessed, from the particular way it had been wound. A careful wrap. Someone who'd taken the time to do it right even when there was no one watching to appreciate it. He heard the screen door and looked up. Clara came across the yard with a plate. On it were 2 biscuits, a piece of salt pork, and a section of corn cake. She held it out to him. He looked at it, then at her. "This yours?" "I made enough for 3. Clem get his." Clem's still asleep. She held the plate out another inch. "It'll get cold." He took it, sat on the edge of the pump housing, watched her start back toward the house. "Clara?" She turned. "Thank you." She looked at him for a moment, and this time what he saw in her face was not the measuring look. It was something quieter and more carefully held, like something she hadn't decided yet whether it was safe to let him see. "Don't mention it," she said, and went back inside. Ethan ate the biscuit and thought, there it is again. He had been in 100 rooms with 100 people who had known exactly who he was and what he owned, and not one of them had ever brought him breakfast, just because it was morning and he might be hungry. He sat in the early summer heat with a plate of food that had been made for him by someone with nothing, and felt the specific unfamiliar weight of being seen by someone who had no reason to look. He stayed. 3 days passed before Gerald Whitmore said more than 6 words to Ethan in a single conversation. On the 4th day, he called him into the house. The inside of the Whitmore house smelled like old wood, and something burned a long time ago that never quite aired out. Gerald sat at the kitchen table with a glass of something that wasn't coffee and gestured at the chair across from him without looking up. Ethan sat. "You do good work," Gerald said. "Clem tells me the south fence hasn't held that well in 2 years. Post needed resetting." "I know what it needed." Gerald took a drink, set the glass down. "I want you to look at the north pasture next. The irrigation ditch has been silting up. Been meaning to get to it all season." "I can do that," Gerald nodded. There was a pause that had weight to it, the kind of pause where the thing that hasn't been said yet is louder than anything else in the room. Ethan waited. "You married?" Gerald asked. "No, sir." "Ever been?" "No." Gerald looked at him then for the first time since he'd sat down. "Smart man," he said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't entirely humor and wasn't entirely bitterness, and sat somewhere in between where old grief tends to calcify into something harder to name. Women complicate things. Ethan said nothing. "My stepdaughter," Gerald said, and stopped, picked up the glass, put it back down without drinking. "She tell you about the Harrington situation?" "Some. Then you know the ranch is in trouble." He said it the way a man says something he's practiced saying flat and businesslike, the emotion scrubbed out of it through repetition. "I've been trying to pull it back for 2 years. It's not working." He paused. "Victor Harrington is not an unreasonable man. The offer he made his son William Clara, it's a practical solution." "Is it what Clara wants?" Ethan said. Gerald's eyes sharpened. "What Clara wants and what the situation requires aren't the same thing." "They rarely are," Ethan said carefully. "In my experience, that gap tends to produce problems." "She'll adjust." Gerald picked up the glass. "Women do." Ethan looked at the table between them and thought about 12 different responses and chose silence, because silence was the only one that wouldn't get him fired on the spot, and he needed to stay on this ranch right now more than he needed to be right. "The irrigation ditch," he said. "I'll start tomorrow morning." Gerald nodded. That was all. Ethan found Clara at the well that evening, pulling up the bucket with both hands, her arms taking the weight evenly. He came up beside her and took the rope without being asked, and she let him, which told him something about how tired she was. "Your stepfather talked to you," he said, not a question. She was quiet long enough that he thought she wasn't going to answer. "Then, last night." "What did you tell him?" "I told him I needed time to think." She took the bucket from him when it reached the top, set it on the edge. What I meant was, I needed time to figure out if there was any other way out of this before I said no, and he found a way to make me say yes anyway. The honesty of it landed clean. Ethan looked at her. Is there another way? I've been trying to find one for 2 weeks. She picked up the bucket. The numbers on this ranch are bad, Thomas. I don't mean struggling but fixable bad. I mean the kind of bad where you start wondering what you misread, and then you realize you didn't misread anything, it's just that bad. She started toward the house. Gerald borrowed more than I knew about. Harrington holds 3 separate notes. If even one of them is called in October. She stopped walking, set the bucket down, turned to look at him. The ranch goes, all of it. And Gerald has no plan for what happens after that, except the one that involves me and William Harrington. Ethan stood very still. What do you know about William Harrington? Something shifted in her expression. I've met him twice. He came out here with his father last spring. She looked down at the bucket. He was polite, very polite. A beat. The way a man is polite when he's been told to be polite but doesn't think you've earned it. What did he say to you? He asked me if I liked horses. She paused. Then he told me his father's ranch had 63 horses and that they had a man to manage them, so I wouldn't need to bother with that sort of thing. She looked up. He said it like he was giving me good news. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. That's not good news. No, she agreed. It's not. She picked up the bucket again. But it might be the only news I've got. She went inside. He stood in the yard and watched the door close behind her and felt something sharp and useless moving around in his chest, the particular feeling of knowing that a situation is wrong and not yet knowing what you can do about it that won't make things worse. The irrigation ditch ran along the north edge of the property for nearly a quarter mile, and it had been silting up slowly for 2 full seasons, which meant the work of clearing it wasn't one morning's labor, but 3 days of steady digging, hauling and rechanneling. Ethan didn't mind. Physical work had always been how he thought best. Clem worked alongside him the first morning, and somewhere around mid-morning the boy said without particular preamble, "You notice anything strange about this place?" "Define strange," Ethan said. "Clara does half the ranch work. Gerald never thanks her. When something goes wrong, it's always her fault somehow. When something goes right, Gerald takes the credit." Clem drove his shovel into the silt with more force than necessary. "I've worked 3 ranches. Never seen it like this. How long has she been here?" "Since she was 18. 8 years. Clem shook his head. "Her mama was a real kind lady. Can tell by how Clara turned out. Apples don't fall far." He paused. "After Mrs. Whitmore died, Gerald changed, got harder. Like he blamed Clara for something only nobody can figure out what." Ethan kept digging. "Does she have anyone family friends in town? Mrs. Porter at the dry goods is nice to her. That's about it." Clem wiped his arm across his forehead. "Most folks in Clover Creek know Gerald. They're polite to Clara, but polite ain't the same as friendly. And Victor Harrington, everybody knows he wants this land. They don't want to get on the wrong side of that." "So she's alone," Ethan said. "Far as I can tell, she always has been." They worked in silence for a while, and Ethan thought about 8 years. 8 years in a house where you were the last one thanked and the first one blamed. 8 years of making yourself useful because useful was the only currency you had. 8 years of watching the land your mother had loved get slowly eaten by debt and bad management, while you looked at the books and did the math and knew exactly how it was going to end. He thought about Catherine in that hallway in Santa Fe. He's so dull. But the land alone is worth $200,000. He thought about Victor Harrington's pleasant voice, a girl in her position. He drove the shovel into the silt and thought there is a certain kind of person in this world who looks at someone else's vulnerability and sees opportunity. And there is another kind who looks at it and sees a person. He had spent the last 3 months trying to figure out which kind still existed. It was on the second day at the irrigation ditch that the first rider came. Ethan heard the horse before he saw it, and when the rider came into view, It was a young man on a very good horse, the kind of horse that announces money before the rider has to say a word. He was well built, maybe 30, with light brown hair and the easy confidence of someone who has never once in his life had to wonder if his presence was welcome. He pulled up at the edge of the pasture and looked down at Ethan. "Where's Whitmore?" he said. "Main house," Ethan said. The young man looked at him for a moment, the look rich men give to laborers, which is not contemptuous exactly, but is something adjacent to it, the look of someone who has ceased to register certain categories of people as requiring full attention. "You the new hand," he said. "Yes, sir. My father hired someone last season who stole a saddle." He said it conversationally, not as an accusation, more as information. "Just so you know, we look out for things like that around here." Ethan looked up at him. "That a fact?" "It is." The young man touched his hat brim, the gesture of someone who has been taught manners but applies them mechanically. "Tell Whitmore William Harrington stopped by." He turned the horse and rode toward the main house unhurried, certain of his welcome. Ethan watched him go. Clem appeared at his elbow. "That's him," the boy said quietly. "William." "I know," Ethan said. "He's come by 3 times in the last month." "To see Whitmore." Clem was quiet for just a beat too long. "Sometimes," he said. Ethan went to the barn at midday to check on June and found Clara there standing with her back against the stall, arms crossed over her chest, staring at nothing with the expression of someone who is working very hard to stay contained. He came in and didn't say anything, just went to the mare, checked her water, ran a hand along her neck. After a while, Clara said, "He brought flowers." Ethan turned. "William?" She said the name with the careful blankness of someone diffusing something. He came inside. Gerald was very welcoming. Offered him coffee. A pause. "William gave me flowers and told me I looked well. Then he talked to Gerald about water rights for 45 minutes. She looked down at her hands. "I sat in the room the whole time and he looked at me twice." "Twice," Ethan said. "Once when he gave me the flowers. Once when he was leaving to check that I was still there." She looked up. "Like checking that a thing is still where you left it." The anger in Ethan's chest was very quiet and very solid, the kind that doesn't move fast. "What did you do?" "I said thank you for the flowers. I put them in a glass of water. I sat in the room." Her voice didn't waver. "Because Gerald was watching and I wasn't ready for the conversation that would happen if I did anything else." "Clara, don't." The word came out sharper than she'd intended. She heard it herself and took a breath. "I'm sorry, I just—" She looked back at the mare. "I know what you're going to say, that I don't have to do this, that I have a choice." She reached out and laid her palm flat against June's neck. "But what you might not understand, Thomas, is that I have been told my entire life what choices look like for a woman in my position, and they look exactly like this." Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Who told you that?" She looked at him. "Specifically," he said, "who in your life sat down with you and showed you that the list of choices available to you is exactly as short as you think it is?" She was very still. "Because in my experience," he said, "the people who are most certain about what someone else's options are tend to be the people who benefit from those options staying limited." The silence stretched out between them taut as a fence wire. "That's easy to say," she said finally, "when you're not the one looking at the options." "You're right," he said. "It is." He left it there. He didn't push. He had learned enough about Clara Whitmore in 4 days to know that pushing wasn't the way. She thought things through at her own pace, and she arrived at her own conclusions. And the worst thing he could do right now was try to hand her his. But he watched her hand on the mare's neck, that still flat palm, taking in the warmth and solidity of the animal, and he thought she knows. She already knows. She just hasn't found the door yet. That evening, something happened that Ethan hadn't planned for. He was at the pump cleaning the grease from his hands when he heard voices from inside the house. Gerald's voice first rising, and then Clara's lower, and then Gerald's again louder, with the particular edge of a man who has been drinking and has confused volume with authority. Ethan went still. He didn't go to the door. That wasn't his right, not yet. But he stayed where he was, and he listened, because something in the tone of it made the hair on his arms stand up. Told you it's a good offer. I understand that, but Gerald, boy has his own property, his own household. You'd be set for life. I'm asking you to give me more time to do what, Clara? What exactly is your plan? You got a plan I don't know about. Silence. That's what I thought. You sit there and think I don't see how this ranch works, but I do. I see you keeping the books. I see the numbers. His voice dropped, and somehow it was worse lower. And I see that you're the one asset on this property that can fix the problem. So I'm asking you to think about that real hard. Another silence. Longer. Then Clara's voice very quiet. I am your wife's daughter. And she's gone, Gerald said. So what that means is up to me now. Ethan heard footsteps. Gerald's moving away. A door inside the house. Silence. He stood at the pump with his hands still. After a while, the lamp in the kitchen window went on, and he could see Clara's silhouette moving around in there. Not urgent, not collapsed, just moving, doing what she always did. Keeping the machinery of the household running because someone had to, and she was the one who knew how. He thought about what she had said that afternoon. I have been told my entire life what choices look like for a woman in my position. He thought Gerald Whitmore did not create that belief in her. He just inherited it and reinforced it and kept it useful. He dried his hands on his work shirt and went back to the bunkhouse and sat on the edge of the bunk and thought for a long time about what he was actually doing here. He had come to find out if there was a person who would treat him decently when he appeared to have nothing. He had found that answer quietly and without any drama in a plate of biscuits brought across a yard in the early morning. In a hand held out with a ladle of water and no ceremony. In the way she'd said, don't mention it, and meant it entirely. But what he hadn't expected, what he had not factored into his plans when he rode out of Callahan Mountain Ranch with $40 and a borrowed name, was that finding what he was looking for would immediately reveal something he hadn't known he was missing. Someone worth protecting. The next morning, Gerald saddled his horse before 7 and rode into town without telling anyone when he'd be back. Clem watched him go and then looked at Ethan with the expression of someone keeping careful score. He does this when something's decided, Clem said. What do you mean? When Gerald makes up his mind about something big, he rides into town first. Gets himself straight, I reckon. Comes back and announces it. Clem looked down. He rode into town the morning my predecessor got fired. Rode into town the morning he signed the second note with Harrington. He paused. Now he's riding into town again. Ethan looked at the track Gerald had taken and thought about the conversation he'd overheard the night before. You're the one asset on this property that can fix the problem. Where's Clara? He said. Barn. He found her exactly where he'd expected, with June working through the morning feeding with the mechanical focus of someone who is using the familiar to keep herself from thinking about something else. She heard him come in and didn't turn around. Gerald rode out, he said. I know. Clem thinks he's gone to make a decision. I know that too. She set down the feed bucket, turned. Her face was composed in that way she had the way of someone who had learned composure as a survival skill. He came and told me last night after... She stopped. He told me he's going to accept the offer. Tell Victor Harrington the arrangement can go forward. Ethan looked at her. What did you say? I said I needed to think. And he said... A pause. He said I could think all I wanted as long as I thought the right way. The words sat in the air between them. Clara, Ethan said. I've been thinking all night, she said, and her voice was still level, but something under it was not. Something under it was moving fast, the way water moves fast under ice that looks still. I've been thinking about what I have and what I don't have, and what I'm willing to do and what I'm not willing to do, and where those two things intersect. She looked at him with those gray eyes, straight and clear. And I keep getting to the same place. Where's that? I'm not willing to do it, she said. I'm not going to marry William Harrington. I don't care what Gerald says. I don't care what it costs. I don't care what the situation requires. She said it the way you say something you've been holding back so long, that when it finally comes out, it comes out whole, perfectly formed, no hesitation. I know that might sound naive. I know that might sound like I haven't thought about what happens after. But I have thought about it. I've thought about it all night. And I'm telling you because... She stopped, looked at him. I don't entirely know why I'm telling you. Ethan said very quietly, because you needed to say it out loud to someone. She looked at him for a long moment. Yes, she said. That. He nodded. Then he said, what happens to you if Gerald follows through and you refuse? He puts me out. No hesitation. He's made that clear. Not in so many words, but clear. Where would you go? She shook her head once, not in defeat, but in the practical acknowledgement of a gap in her planning. I don't know yet. All right, Ethan said. He said it the way he said most things, plain, without extra weight. Then we need to figure that out. She stared at him. You said you were telling me, so now I know. He held her gaze. That makes it a we, unless you say otherwise. The expression that crossed her face then was one he hadn't seen from her before. Not the careful measuring. Not the controlled composure. Something more unguarded and more surprised, and a little bit frightened in the way that unexpected kindness can be frightening when you haven't been shown much of it. You don't know me, she said. I know enough, he said. That's not Clara. He waited until she stopped. A person who brings breakfast to a stranger who just started working for them because it was morning and they might be hungry. I know enough. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. And then she said, Gerald will be back by noon. Then we've got until noon, he said. Let's use it. They sat outside the barn in the shade, and for the next 2 hours they talked in the practical, honest way of two people working a problem together. She told him about the notes, 3 of them totaling more than Gerald had told her about, which she'd found out by going through his papers one night when he was in town. She told him about the water rights dispute Harrington was really after, which had nothing to do with Clara, and everything to do with a spring on the north corner of the Whitmore property that fed into a creek that ran through Harrington land. She told him about Gerald's 2 failed attempts to find a buyer for a back section of the property, both of which Harrington had quietly blocked. Ethan listened. He asked questions. Precise ones, the kind of questions that tell a person you are actually listening and not just waiting for them to stop talking. And Clara. Clara watched him while she answered that measuring look, doing its work, and what Ethan thought he could see happening in real time was a recalibration. The slow, careful revision of an initial assessment. He had filed himself as a ranch hand. She was refiling him as something she didn't have a category for yet. You know a lot about business, she said at one point. I've worked different places, he said. Ranches, among other things. She looked at him for a moment, and then, surprising him, What aren't you telling me? He looked back at her steadily. Probably more than I should be, he said. But nothing that changes what I'm telling you right now, which is that Gerald can't sell you. Not legally, not morally, and not practically. He paused. You're 26 years old. You are under no legal obligation to this man. His debts are not your debts. His decisions are not your future, unless you let them be. Easy to say, she said, and this time it wasn't defensive. It was just honest. When you leave here, you go somewhere else. When I leave here, I go... She spread her hands. I know, he said. That's the part we need to figure out. She looked at him, and again that flicker of something unguarded. Why are you doing this? He was quiet for a moment. Honest answer or careful answer, those were the 2 options. He chose as close to honest as he could get, without explaining things he wasn't ready to explain. "Because you brought me breakfast," he said. "And because watching someone treat a person the way Gerald treats you does something to a man who was raised to know better." Clara looked at him for a long time, and then very softly she laughed. It was the first time he'd heard her laugh. It was small and quick and surprised at itself the way laughter is when it catches you off guard after a long dry spell. "That's a strange reason," she said. "It's the true one," he said. She looked down at her hands. The laugh had faded, but something it had loosened stayed loose. Something around her eyes some held tension that had been there every time he'd looked at her. "Gerald will come back," she said, "and he'll have an answer to give Harrington one way or another." "Yes," Ethan said, "and I'll need to have an answer for Gerald." "Yes." She looked up at him. "I'm going to say no," she said. "I've decided. I just needed—" She stopped. "Someone to say it to first," he said. She nodded once. "Yes." Ethan nodded back. Then he heard hoofbeats on the main track, a horse coming in at the pace of a man who had finished his business in town and was coming home with something settled in his chest. Gerald was back. Clara heard it too. She stood in one motion, brushed the dust from her skirt in those quick, practical sweeps. She looked down at Ethan, and in her face he saw the composure sliding back into place like a shutter closing, but not all the way. Not quite all the way. "Whatever happens when I walk in there," she said quietly, "thank you for this morning." She walked toward the house steady and straight, and Ethan watched her and thought she has been doing this her whole life. Walking toward the hard thing with her back straight and her hands steady and nobody walking beside her. He thought not today. He stood up. He followed her. Not into the house that was her territory, her moment, her fight. But he stood at the edge of the yard where Gerald could see him if Gerald looked out, and he stayed there while Clara went through the door, and he waited. Because someone should have waited for her a long time ago. And inside, he heard the sound of a woman who had run out of silence and was finally starting to speak. He heard her voice first, not the words, the voice itself. The particular quality of it, the way it had changed from the careful, controlled tone she used around Gerald to something harder and cleaner, like a wire pulled taut enough to sing. Ethan stood in the yard and listened. "I said no, Gerald." Gerald's response came back lower, the way his voice always dropped when he was working up to something. Ethan couldn't make out the words, but he could make out the shape of them, the slow, patient, relentless shape of a man who was used to wearing people down. Then Clara again louder. "That is not your decision to make." Something shifted in the air. Ethan took one step toward the door and stopped himself. Not yet. She had walked in there on her own terms, and she needed to walk this part on her own terms too. He understood that about her, now that the worst thing he could do for Clara Whitmore was treat her like someone who needed to be carried. But he stayed close. Close enough. Inside, Gerald's voice rose suddenly to fill the whole ground floor of the house. "You ungrateful, do you have any idea what I've given up for you, what I've carried since your mother died? This ranch should have been sold 2 years ago. 2 years I've been holding on, and this is the one way out that makes sense, and you're standing here telling me no." "Yes," Clara said. "That is exactly what I'm telling you. You don't have the right. I have every right." Her voice didn't shake. That was the thing that struck Ethan most, standing in the yard with his hands still at his sides. Her voice did not shake. "I am not a piece of this land, Gerald. I am not cattle. I am not a note you can hand to Victor Harrington to settle a debt. I am my mother's daughter, and she would be ashamed of what you're asking me to do." The silence after that was the loudest thing Ethan had heard since he'd arrived. Then Gerald said very quietly, and somehow the quiet was worse, "Get out of my house." A beat. "Excuse me," Clara said. "You heard me. If you won't do what this family needs, then you're not part of this family. Get your things and get out." Another silence, shorter this time. Then footsteps, steady, even footsteps moving toward the stairs. Ethan let out a slow breath. She hadn't crumbled. She hadn't begged. She had stood in that room and said no to the first person in her life who had ever had the power to make that word cost her everything. And now she was going to pack her things. He went to the barn. He was saddling Cinder when she came out 20 minutes later carrying a bag that wasn't large enough for everything she owned, which told him she'd packed only what she could carry and left the rest. She stopped when she saw him and the horse and the second horse he'd pulled from the stall and saddled beside Cinder. "What are you doing?" she said. "Getting ready to ride," he said. "Thomas, you need somewhere to go." He checked the cinch on the second saddle without looking at her. "I know somewhere." She stood very still. "You can't just, Clara." He turned then and looked at her directly. "You just did the bravest thing I've watched a person do in a long time. Don't waste it standing in this yard." She looked at him for a long moment, and in her face, he saw the thing that fear looks like when it has been faced down, not gone, but smaller. Managed. "Where?" she said. "North of here, about 4 hours." He handed her the reins of the second horse, a bay gelding named Franklin that Gerald would probably object to losing, but Gerald had forfeited some of his objections this morning. "There's a ranch. Good people. You'll be safe while we figure out the next thing." "We," she said again. Same word she'd caught on before. "Unless you have a better option," he said. She didn't say anything, but she took the reins. They rode out of the Whitmore yard at noon, and Ethan did not look back. Clara did. Once he heard the small shift in her saddle, the brief pause in Franklin's rhythm as she turned. Whatever she saw or didn't see or felt or didn't feel in that moment, she kept to herself. She turned forward again, and they rode north in the summer heat, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. It was Clara who broke the silence a full hour into the ride somewhere on the long stretch of open ground between the Whitmore property and the first low hills. "He'll tell people I left without permission," she said. "He'll make it sound like I stole the horse." "I know," Ethan said. "And Gerald knows Victor Harrington. Victor Harrington knows everyone in 3 counties. She looked straight ahead. "This isn't going to be simple." "No," Ethan said. "It isn't." She absorbed that. "You're not going to tell me it'll be fine." "No." She glanced at him sidelong. "Most people would. Most people say that when they want you to stop worrying so they don't have to think about your problem anymore." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "The situation is complicated. Pretending it isn't doesn't help you." Another silence, this one easier. "What is this ranch?" she said. "The one we're going to." He took a breath. He'd known this moment was coming. He'd been deciding for the last hour exactly how much to say and when. "It's a working ranch," he said carefully. "About 3,000 acres in the hill country north of here. Horses mainly, some cattle." "Who owns it?" A pause. "Someone I know well." She looked at him. The measuring look again sharper now. "That's not an answer." "It's the answer I've got right now," he said. She was quiet for a long moment. He could feel her thinking beside him, the way you feel another person's concentration when you're riding close. "You're not who you said you are," she said. It wasn't a question. He didn't answer immediately. "Thomas Greyhorse," she said, and something in her voice had changed. Not angry, not frightened, but alert the way a person gets alert when the map they've been using stops matching the terrain. "That's not your real name." "No," he said. "It isn't." The word landed between them and sat there. She didn't pull her horse up. She didn't raise her voice. She just rode for another 30 seconds very straight in the saddle, and then she said, "Are you going to tell me?" "Yes," he said. "But not yet, not out here." He looked at her. "I need you to trust me for about 3 more hours, and then I'll tell you everything. And if after that you want nothing to do with me, I'll respect that completely, and make sure you're somewhere safe before I leave." She considered this with the same practical, unsentimental focus she brought to broken fence posts and bad ledgers. "Everything," she said. "Everything," he confirmed. "All right," she said, and looked forward again. He exhaled. They stopped at a creek in the early afternoon to water the horses and rest. Clara sat on a flat rock and ate the half a biscuit she'd put in her coat pocket. He noticed that the biscuit and thought about what it said about a person, that when they were told to pack their things and leave the thing they thought to bring for the journey, was food not for themselves first, but the kind of small portable thing you bring when you've learned to take care of your own needs quietly, without making a scene. He pulled dried beef from his saddlebag and held it out to her without comment. She took it. "Thank you." "You should eat more than a biscuit." "I know." She ate in quick, practical bites. Then, "How long have you been doing this?" "Doing what?" "Appearing to be something you're not." She said it without accusation, which made it harder to deflect. "A while," he said. "Why?" He sat down on the rock beside her, not close, but near enough for conversation. He looked at the creek running over the stones, clear and fast, the way water always seems more certain of where it's going than the people watching it. "I needed to know something," he said. "Something I couldn't find out if people knew who I was." She waited. "I needed to know if there was anyone left who would treat a man decently when he had nothing." He paused. "I've spent 10 years being treated very well by people who wanted something from me. I had started to think that was all there was." Clara was quiet. Then, "And what did you find?" He looked at her. She looked back at him, steady and clear. "I found a woman who brought breakfast to a stranger because it was morning and he might be hungry," he said, "and didn't want anything back for it." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she looked away out at the creek and swallowed. He could see the muscle in her jaw work the effort of receiving something without deflecting it, which was a skill nobody had ever taught her. "That's a very small thing," she said. "No," he said. "It isn't." None. They reached the North Road in the mid-afternoon, and that was where they found Victor Harrington waiting. He was not alone. He had 2 men with him, ranch hands big, stationed on either side of the road, like they'd been placed there, which they had. Victor himself sat his white horse with the same pleasant, unhurried authority he always carried, and when he saw them coming, he raised one hand in a calm greeting, as though this were a coincidence rather than an interception. Ethan's jaw tightened. He kept his pace steady. "Miss Whitmore," Victor said when they were close enough. His tone was warm, concerned, the tone of a man performing genuine distress for an audience. "I'm glad we found you. Gerald is very worried." "Gerald told me to leave," Clara said. Her voice was even. "So I left. There seems to have been a misunderstanding." "There was no misunderstanding," she said. He was very clear. Victor's gaze moved to Ethan. Something in it sharpened. "And who might you be?" "Ranch hand," Ethan said. "Gerald's ranch hand." "I was." Victor looked at him for another moment, the particular look of a man accessing a mental catalog of everyone he knows and finding a gap. He didn't recognize Ethan. That was good. But a man like Victor Harrington didn't need to recognize you to assess you, and what Ethan saw in that assessment was the moment Victor categorized him as a problem of a manageable size. "Miss Whitmore," Victor said, turning back to Clara, "I think you should come back with us. Whatever disagreement you and Gerald have had, this is not the time or the way to resolve it." Running off with a ranch hand. He let the pause do the work that the words didn't need to. The implication settled in the air like smoke. Clara's chin came up. "I am not running anywhere. I made a decision." "My dear, you're upset. Don't." Her voice cut through his pleasantness like a blade through cloth. "Don't speak to me like I'm a child having a difficulty. You came to Gerald's house and discussed my future as a financial arrangement. You talked about me in a room I was sitting in, as if I were a parcel of land that came with the property." She held his gaze without flinching. "I am not upset. I am decided, and I am leaving." She moved Franklin forward. One of Victor's men shifted his horse to block the road. The movement was subtle, practiced the way practiced intimidation always is. Not a threat exactly, just a fact, a horse in the way, a road that suddenly required permission. Ethan moved Cinder forward and to the left, putting himself between Clara and the man on the road, and he said nothing. He didn't have to. The physical language of it was perfectly clear. This is where I stand, and I am not moving. Victor looked at him again. The pleasant expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "You're making a mistake," Victor said. He said it to Ethan, not to Clara, which was itself a message. "Probably made a few of those," Ethan said. "Seems to be the nature of the thing." A long beat. Then Victor said mildly, "I don't believe I know your name." "No," Ethan agreed. "You don't." Another beat, longer. The man blocking the road looked at Victor, waiting for direction. Victor looked at Ethan with the eyes of someone recalculating. Then smoothly Victor tilted his head. The man moved his horse aside. "Safe travels," Victor said pleasantly, as though he were seeing off guests at a dinner party, as though nothing had happened, as though the conversation were entirely concluded, and entirely in his favor, which was the most unsettling thing about it. Ethan and Clara rode through the gap without hurrying. They didn't speak until the Harrington horses were out of earshot. Then Clara said very quietly, "He's going to come after us." "Yes," Ethan said. He didn't back down. He just moved aside. "That's what men like Victor Harrington do," Ethan said. "They don't lose. They just wait for better terrain." She absorbed that. "What do? We ride," he said. "And when we get where we're going, I tell you everything. And then we figure out the terrain before he does." The light had gone gold and long by the time the Callahan Mountain Ranch came into view. Clara pulled Franklin to a stop. She stared. Ethan watched her face. The ranch spread across the hillside, the way things spread when they've been tended for a long time, by someone who cared about them, not showy, not grand in the way of new money, but solid and settled and real. The main house was timber and stone, 2 stories with a wide porch along the front. The barn was large and well maintained. The fencing ran straight and tight for as far as she could see. "Thomas," she said. "Ethan," he said. She turned to look at him. "My name is Ethan Callahan," he said. "This is my ranch." The silence that followed was the most complicated silence of the entire ride. Clara looked at the ranch, then at him, then at the ranch again. He could see her doing the arithmetic, all the small things that hadn't quite added up. The questions he'd answered sideways, the knowledge he'd displayed that didn't fit the clothes he was wearing. He watched her refile every conversation they'd had through this new information, and he waited, because there was nothing else he could do. "How much," she said finally, "is this worth?" he told her. She closed her eyes for a moment. "And you worked for Gerald Whitmore," she said, "for cut-rate wages." "Yes." "And let me believe you were a nobody with nowhere to go." "Yes." "Why?" The word came out with an edge on it now, not fury, not yet, but the first heat of something that was working out whether it wanted to become fury. "Because I needed to know," he said. "The same reason I told you before. I needed to know if there was a person alive who would treat me like a person when they thought I was nobody." He held her gaze. "And you did. Every day. Without knowing. Without any reason to." "That wasn't your decision to make," she said. "Whether to tell me." "No," he said. "It wasn't. And I'm sorry for that. Genuinely." She sat on Franklin and looked at him, and in her face he saw something working through the anger and the surprise, and underneath both of those, something else, something that was checking the record of every interaction they'd had and finding that nothing had actually changed, that every word he'd said was still true, that every moment between them had still been real. It didn't make the deception smaller, but it changed the shape of it. "You could have told me on the road," she said, "after we left the ranch." "I could have," he said. "I was trying to find the right moment. That's not an excuse, it's just the truth." She looked at him for a long time. The gold light was fading. The air was cooling the way high country air cools in summer, fast and clear. "Is there anyone here?" she said finally. "My foreman Henry, 2 hands. A woman who keeps the house, Mrs. Avery. They're all good people." Another silence. "I'm not going back," she said. "Whatever this is, whatever I think about any of this, I'm not going back to Gerald. You don't have to. And I won't be—" She stopped, chose her words. "I won't be something you've collected, something you've brought back from a trip." The words hit him exactly where they were aimed, and he didn't flinch from them because she was right to say them. "No," he said. "That's not what this is. I swear to you." She held his gaze for one more long moment. Then she clicked her tongue at Franklin and rode toward the gate. Henry Walsh was 61 years old, weathered to the color of old fence posts, and had worked for Ethan Callahan for 16 years. He came out of the barn when they rode in and took one look at Ethan, at the canvas shirt, the cracked boots, the 11 days of road on him, and said, without any particular surprise, "Find what you were looking for." "Some of it," Ethan said. Henry looked at Clara with the careful, non-intrusive assessment of a man who had seen enough of life to know when a woman arriving at a door needed to be greeted with respect and not questions. He took off his hat. "Ma'am?" "This is Clara Whitmore," Ethan said. "She's a guest. She'll need a room in the main house, and Mrs. Avery should know she's staying." "I'll tell her," Henry said. He looked at Ethan again. "You all right?" "Fine," Ethan said. "We had a run-in with Victor Harrington on the North Road." Henry's expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "How bad does civil for now?" "Harrington's civil for now tends to have a short shelf life." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why I need you to ride to town tomorrow morning and see our lawyer. Tell him we may be dealing with some claims coming out of the Whitmore situation. Tell him to be ready." Henry nodded once, put his hat back on, and took Cinder's reins. "Mrs. Avery's got supper on," he said. "Hour, maybe." He led the horses away and didn't ask another question, which was one of the many reasons Ethan had kept him for 16 years. Mrs. Avery was 73, had opinions about everything, and expressed them without preamble. She was a small woman who moved through the main house like she owned it, which in every practical sense she did. And when Clara came through the door, she took one look at her, took the bag from her hand and said, "You look like you haven't eaten a proper meal in a week. Sit down." Clara blinked. "Sit," Mrs. Avery said. Not unkindly, just firmly in the way of someone for whom kindness and firmness were the same thing. "I've got beans and cornbread and a pork shoulder that's been going since morning. You can tell me your name and your story while I finish setting the table, or you can just sit and be quiet and eat. Either one is fine with me." Clara looked at the table. Then she sat down. Ethan came in behind her, and Mrs. Avery looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for him when she thought he'd done something that needed examining. He met her gaze. She gave him a small, significant nod that communicated approximately 16 things, and went back to the kitchen. They ate. It was a real meal. The first real meal Clara had eaten at a table where no one was going to comment on whether she'd earned her place at it. Ethan watched her not intrusively from across the table, and what he saw was the particular quality of someone eating carefully, at first still braced for something, and then slowly just eating. Mrs. Avery talked. She talked about the horse foaling last spring that had kept everyone up 3 nights. She talked about the trouble with the North Creek last summer. She talked about the summer she was Clara's age, and had made a decision that everyone around her said was wrong, which had turned out to be the best decision she'd ever made. She said nothing directly about Clara's situation, but every word she said was about it. Clara listened, and after a while she said, "How long have you worked here?" 12 years, Mrs. Avery said. "Since before Ethan had the sense he has now, which is saying something." She set a dish of butter on the table with the authority of a woman placing a chess piece. "He was a very serious young man when I first came. Everything was land and money and what needed doing. Never talked to people just because." She glanced at Ethan. "Better now." "Thank you, Mrs. Avery," Ethan said. "I'm not complimenting you, I'm describing a process." She sat down. "He's better now," she said to Clara, as if Ethan weren't in the room. "Still doesn't say enough. Still thinks that keeping quiet about things that matter is the same as being careful. It isn't." She buttered a piece of cornbread. But he's decent. And decent, in my experience, is rarer than money. Clara looked at the cornbread in front of her. Then she said quietly, "I know." Good. After supper, Ethan found Clara on the porch. She was standing at the rail looking out at the dark, her arms loose at her sides, and she looked the way people look after a day that's had too many things in it, not defeated, but settled, the way water settles after being stirred. He came out and stood beside her and didn't speak. After a while she said, "Victor Harrington isn't going to let this go. No. He wants the Whitmore land, and he's going to say Gerald's going to say—" She stopped. "They'll make it sound like I was taken, like I didn't choose." "Let them," Ethan said. She turned to look at him. "That's easy to say. I know it is," he said. "And I also know that Victor Harrington has spent his entire career building situations where the other person doesn't have options. He buys up the notes. He blocks the sales. He waits until someone is desperate enough to take his terms." He turned to look back at her. "But there's a thing he doesn't know yet." "What?" "He doesn't know who I am," Ethan said. "He met a ranch hand on a road. He doesn't know this ranch. He doesn't know the resources we have, and he doesn't know—" He paused. "He doesn't know that those notes Gerald signed, 2 of the 3 of them have a legal problem." Clara stared at him. "What?" "I'm not a lawyer," he said, "but I know land law well enough to read a contract. Henry's going to our lawyer tomorrow morning. If what I think I saw in Gerald's ledger is right, the ledger you described with the terms of the notes Victor Harrington may have been collecting on paper, he doesn't legally hold." The silence stretched. "How do you know about Gerald's ledger?" she said. "You told me about it. On the road. You said you'd looked at the books. You told me the terms." She ran back through the conversation, and he watched her do it, watched her find the moment and check it. "I told you the general structure," she said slowly. "The general structure was enough." He looked at her directly. "Clara, Harrington built this situation on Gerald's desperation and Gerald's ignorance. If the paperwork isn't right, then the whole thing is built on ground that won't hold." He paused. "We need to find that out before he comes here, because he will come here." She absorbed this in the careful, methodical way she absorbed everything. "Then, what do you need from me? Everything you remember about what you read, every number, every term, every date." She nodded slowly. "And Clara?" He waited until she looked at him. "What happened today, what you did in that house, what you said to Gerald, that wasn't nothing. I need you to understand that. A lot of people would have looked at the situation and taken the easier road. The easier road wasn't easier," she said. "It just looked that way from outside." "I know," he said. She looked at him for a moment. In the dark, in the cool summer air, she looked both more tired and more solid than he'd ever seen her, the way people look sometimes after they've made the hard decision, when the relief of having made it finally catches up with the cost of it. "I'm going to go write down what I remember," she said. "About the ledger. Before I forget any of it. There's paper and ink in the study," he said. "Second door on the left." She nodded. She started back toward the door. Then she stopped, turned back. "Ethan," she said, his own name from her mouth, the first time. "Yes," he said. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment in which she seemed to be weighing something, deciding whether to say it or not, and deciding yes. "Thank you," she said, "for standing in the yard." He didn't say anything. "When I walked into that house," she said, "I looked back right before I went through the door. And you were standing in the yard." She held his gaze. "Nobody has stood in the yard for me before." She went inside. Ethan stood on the porch in the summer dark for a long time. In the barn, one of the horses shifted. Somewhere on the north ridge, a nighthawk called. He thought Victor Harrington is going to come. He thought Gerald Whitmore is going to make noise. He thought there are 3 notes on paper that may not be legally sound, and a lawyer in town who needs to know that by tomorrow morning, and a woman inside writing down everything she remembers from a ledger she read by lamplight, while her stepfather slept, Because she always read the books, because nobody else did. Because she had spent 8 years doing the thing that needed doing even when no one asked her to, and no one thanked her for it. He thought that is not a woman who needs saving. That is a woman who needed someone to stand in the yard. He was glad he had. Henry Walsh came back from town at 10:30 the next morning, and Ethan knew from the way he tied his horse fast efficient, none of the usual easy movements of a man returning from an ordinary errand, that what he'd learned had weight to it. Ethan met him in the yard. Henry pulled off his hat and held it in both hands. "Lawyer says you were right," he said. 2 of the 3 notes Harrington holds on Whitmore property were transferred from the original lender without proper documentation. The assignment of debt wasn't filed correctly with the county, means Harrington's been collecting on paper that isn't legally his to collect on. Ethan was still for a moment. "How solid is that?" "Lawyer says very. Says he's seen Harrington do this before, buys debt. Informally doesn't file the paperwork right, counts on the debtor not knowing enough to check." Henry's jaw was tight. "He also says there's something else." "What?" "Harrington's been to the sheriff already this morning, filed a report, says Clara Whitmore was taken from the Whitmore ranch under duress, says you coerced her." Henry met his eyes. "Says you're holding her against her will." The words landed hard. Ethan turned without a word and walked toward the house. He found Clara in the study where he'd left her the night before, except she was still there, which meant she'd worked through most of the night. Papers covered the desk in careful rows, her handwriting filling 3 sheets with dates and figures and terms. She looked up when he came in, and she must have read something in his face immediately because she straightened in the chair. "What happened?" she said. He told her. All of it. The notes, the legal problem with the paperwork, and then Harrington's report to the sheriff. She sat very still through all of it. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she stood up. "Take me to the sheriff," she said. "Clara." "Right now, Ethan." Her voice was completely level. "If Harrington told the sheriff I was taken against my will, then the sheriff needs to hear from me directly, today, before any story has time to harden." She looked at him with those clear gray eyes. "I will not let them tell my story for me. Not this time." He looked at her, at the circles under her eyes, from a night's work, at the 3 sheets of careful figures she'd written out at the particular set of her jaw that he was coming to recognize as the expression she wore when she had decided something and the deciding was finished. "All right," he said. "I want to bring the papers," she said. "What I wrote last night, if the lawyer can use them." "He can," Ethan said. "Bring them." She gathered the sheets and had her coat on before he reached the door. The ride into Clover Creek took 40 minutes, and they did it at a pace that covered ground without announcing urgency, because arriving in a hurry tells a story before you've opened your mouth. Henry rode with them. He didn't say it was for protection, and Ethan didn't say it either, but they both knew. The town was going about its Tuesday morning in the particular way of small towns that have recently received significant news, which is to say that people were doing ordinary things with an unusual degree of attention paid to the street. 2 women outside the dry goods store stopped talking when Ethan and Clara rode past. A man on the barbershop steps looked up and held the look too long. Clara sat straight on Franklin and looked straight ahead. The sheriff's office was at the end of the main street, a 1-room building with a wood plank sign. Sheriff Dale Pruitt was a wide, deliberate man of about 50, who had held the office for 11 years by the consistent application of a simple philosophy: hear both sides before you decide anything, and don't let anyone rush either step. He was standing outside his door when they rode up, which meant he'd either seen them coming or had been expecting them. Both, probably. "Miss Whitmore?" he said when Clara stepped down. His tone was measured. "Careful. I was wondering when you'd come in." "Then you've heard from Victor Harrington," she said. "I have." He looked at Ethan. "And you'd be the man he's describing." "Ethan Callahan," Ethan said. "Callahan Mountain Ranch north of here." Something shifted in Pruitt's expression. Callahan. He said the name the way people say the name of a place they know the location of but haven't visited. "That Callahan." "Yes," Ethan said. Pruitt looked at him for a long moment, and Ethan could see the sheriff reassembling the story he'd been told that morning, fitting this new piece in, watching the picture change. "Come inside," he said. They sat across the desk from Pruitt, and Clara talked. She talked for 20 minutes straight, and she talked the way she did everything with complete precision, no drama, no embellishment, every fact in its right place. She described the notes. She described Gerald's situation. She described the conversation she had overheard between Gerald and Victor the morning of her first week. She didn't say how she'd overheard it, and Pruitt didn't ask. She described what Gerald had told her. She described what she had told Gerald. Then she put the 3 sheets of paper on the desk. "These are the terms of the 3 notes as best I can reconstruct them from the ledger," she said. "I've been reading Gerald's books for 2 years. These figures are accurate." Pruitt looked at the papers. He picked up the first one, read it slowly, put it down, picked up the second. His expression didn't change, but something behind it did. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "did you leave the Whitmore ranch of your own will?" "Yes. No one forced you." "No one. And you are currently at Callahan Ranch of your own choosing?" "Yes." She held his gaze. "Sheriff, I am 26 years old. I am not Gerald Whitmore's property. I am not a debt he can pay with. And I am not confused about my own actions." She paused. "What I am is a woman who read a ledger that showed Victor Harrington may be collecting on legal instruments he doesn't properly own. I thought you should know that." Pruitt sat back in his chair. He was quiet for a good long while, the quality of quiet that means genuine thinking rather than the performance of it. Then he said, "I'm going to need to speak with the County Land Records Office, and I'm going to want your lawyer's assessment of these notes in writing." He looked at Ethan. "Callahan." "Sheriff?" "Victor Harrington is a powerful man in this county." "Yes," Ethan said, "he is. He's also apparently a man who files paperwork sloppily when he thinks no one's checking." "Also yes," Ethan said. Pruitt looked at the papers again. "The complaint he filed this morning is withdrawn as of right now. Miss Whitmore has made her situation abundantly clear." He stood. "I'd appreciate it if you'd both stay available. This isn't over." "We know," Clara said. They rode out of Clover Creek 20 minutes later, and it was only when the town was well behind them that Clara let out a slow, long breath that she'd been holding, it seemed, for most of the morning. "You did well in there," Ethan said. "I was terrified," she said. "I know." She looked at him sidelong. "You couldn't tell." "A little," he said. "Your left hand was gripping the reins harder than Franklin needed." She looked down at her hand on the reins. Then she laughed, that small, quick, surprised laugh he'd heard once before in the Whitmore barn, the one that caught itself off guard. "8 years of practice," she said, "keeping composed around men who want to see you break. It shows," he said, "in the best possible way." She glanced at him, then looked forward again, but she didn't stop, almost smiling. Harrington came the next day. He came in the afternoon with 2 men Ethan didn't recognize, dressed in good clothes, riding good horses. And he came up the main track of Callahan Ranch with the easy pace of a man who believes that his arrival anywhere is a welcome event. Ethan was at the barn with Henry when he heard them, and he walked out to meet them in the yard and stopped 15 feet from Harrington's horse. "Victor," he said. Harrington looked down at him from the saddle, and this time, now that he knew the name, now that the ranch spread out behind him supplied context. His expression was the expression of a man adjusting, not rattled. Victor Harrington didn't rattle, but adjusting, recalibrating, filing this against everything he'd thought he understood about the situation. "Callahan," Victor said. The pleasantness was intact. It was always intact. "I had no idea you were involved in this. Wasn't trying to hide it," Ethan said. "I just didn't have occasion to introduce myself on the road the other day." "No." Victor studied him. "I suppose you didn't." He looked at the ranch behind Ethan, the long sweep of it, and something moved through his eyes that wasn't admiration, but was something adjacent, the look of a man assessing acreage. "This is quite a property." "It is," Ethan agreed. "I didn't realize you'd taken on hands from the Whitmore ranch." "One," Ethan said. "Clara Whitmore is staying here." "Ah." The pleasantness didn't waver. "Callahan, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Clara is a young woman in a difficult situation. Gerald Whitmore is. He's a troubled man, I'll grant you, not always reasonable. But the arrangement with my son was genuinely meant to help her." "She didn't want it," Ethan said. "She was upset." "She was clear," Ethan said. "There's a difference." Victor looked at him for a long moment. Then the pleasantness shifted. Not disappeared, but thinned the way ice thins in spring, still present, but with something different visible through it. "The Whitmore notes come due in October," Victor said. "When Gerald can't pay, and he won't be able to pay, that property reverts. That's just law, Callahan. That's just how it works." "It is," Ethan said. "Assuming the notes are valid." A pause. Very small. Very telling. "Of course they're valid," Victor said. "Our lawyer seems to have some questions about the assignment documentation on 2 of the 3, Ethan said. "I'm sure it's just a filing error. These things happen." He said it pleasantly, in exactly the same tone Victor had used for the last 4 minutes. "Shouldn't take more than a week or 2 to sort out with the county records office." The thin ice cracked. Not on Victor's face, his face stayed composed. But in his hands Ethan saw it. The slight involuntary tightening of the reins. A man's body knowing something his expression hadn't admitted yet. "I'll want to speak with Clara," Victor said. "She's not available today," Ethan said. "Callahan." "She's not available," Ethan said again in the same level voice. "If she wants to speak with you, she'll send word. That's her decision to make." Victor looked at him for a long moment with the measuring eyes of a man who has won a very large number of negotiations and is calculating whether this one is won or lost or still in play. Then he turned his horse. "We'll be in touch through the legal channels," he said, and rode down the track with his 2 men unhurried, as though he were leaving because he chose to, and not because he'd run out of ground. Henry came to stand beside Ethan, and they watched him go. "He's going to move fast now," Henry said. "Yes," Ethan said. "So are we." Clara was in the study when Ethan came inside. She had heard the horses. She had heard the voices, too. The window was open, and sound carries in summer heat. And when Ethan came in, she was standing with her arms crossed and her eyes sharp. "He wanted to speak with me," she said. "Yes." "You told him no." "I told him it was your decision." He looked at her. "Do you want to speak with him?" She was quiet for a moment. "No," she said. "Not yet. Not until I know what we're working with legally." She looked at the papers on the desk. "How fast can your lawyer move on the note issue?" "Fast," Ethan said. "If the documents are as flawed as he thinks, he can file a challenge with the county by end of week." And Gerald, this was the part Ethan had been turning over since the night before. "Gerald is a victim of this too, in his way," he said carefully. "He's a foolish man who made bad decisions. But Harrington created the conditions for those decisions. If the notes are invalidated, Gerald's situation changes. He might lose the ranch anyway. The first note is clean, but he wouldn't lose it to Harrington. He might be able to sell properly, pay the valid debt, come out with something." Clara looked at him. "You're trying to help Gerald." "I'm trying to resolve the situation fairly," he said. "There's a difference." She was quiet for a moment, then softer. "Gerald told me I was the most useful thing he had left." "I remember," Ethan said. "He was wrong," she said. "But he was scared. Gerald has been scared for 2 years and didn't know how to say that to anyone." She looked down at the desk. "That doesn't make what he did right. It doesn't make any of it right. But he was my mother's husband, and she loved him once, when he was better than he became." She paused. "I don't want to destroy him. I just want to not be what he destroys. Ethan looked at her. There it was, the thing that made Clara Whitmore herself, the particular grain of her, the thing he had been trying to name for 2 weeks. She had been wronged by Gerald Whitmore in ways that were specific and lasting and real, and she was standing in his study, sorting the wrongness of it from the man himself, keeping them separate, refusing to let what had been done to her determine how she treated the person who'd done it. That was not weakness. That was harder than fury. "Then we do this right," he said. "We let the law handle the notes. We don't push Gerald harder than the situation requires, and we make sure Harrington doesn't get to define what happened here." She nodded. "What do you need from me?" "Everything you remember about the ranch finances, and—" He paused. "There might be a moment where you need to speak publicly. To the county land office, maybe. Or in front of the sheriff and Harrington both. To say clearly on record what happened and what you chose." "I know," she said. She didn't flinch from it. "I've been thinking about that." She looked up. "When I was in Gerald's house, I never spoke in front of anyone that mattered. I was always in a room where the people listening had already decided I didn't count." She held his gaze. "That was the thing that made it so easy for Gerald and for Harrington. I was quiet where it mattered. I kept everything inside that room." She straightened. "I'm done with that." Ethan nodded. He thought she has been building toward this her whole life without knowing it. 4 days passed. They were the fastest 4 days Ethan had spent in a long time, and they were full of conversations with the lawyer, with Henry, with the county records clerk that Henry's wife knew from church, who confirmed quietly, and without official standing, that yes, there were irregularities in the Harrington-Whitmore assignment documents, and yes, she had seen it before with Harrington's paperwork, and yes, she had always wondered when someone would look closely enough to notice. Clara worked. That was the constant through all 4 days Clara working. She learned the rhythm of Callahan Ranch quickly, the way a person learns a piece of music they already know the structure of, because she had been doing the practical work of a ranch for 8 years, and the instruments were familiar, even if the song was new. She talked to Mrs. Avery about the household accounts, and Mrs. Avery said on the second day that she had a better head for figures than any 3 men put together, and she said it directly to Clara's face, and Clara had looked at the table for a moment before she could look up. She helped Henry with the horse records on the 3rd day, going through the ledger with him, and Henry said afterward to Ethan, "She caught 2 billing errors I'd had in there since March. Didn't make a thing of it, just quietly fixed them and moved on." "That sounds right," Ethan said. "She's good people," Henry said simply. On the 4th morning, a letter arrived from Gerald. Ethan brought it to Clara without opening it. She took it, looked at the handwriting on the front for a moment, and then broke the seal. He didn't watch her read it. He went to the window and looked out at the yard and gave her the private space of whatever it contained. After a while she said, "He wants to talk." Ethan turned. "Not here," she said. "He wants to meet in town, at the minister's house. Reverend Caleb, he knows him." She folded the letter. "He says he wants to explain, and that he's not. He says he's not going to push the Harrington arrangement anymore." "Do you believe him?" She thought about that seriously, the way she thought about everything. "I think he's frightened," she said. "I think someone told him about the note irregularities, and he realized Harrington wasn't what he thought he was." She paused. "And I think he wants to feel better about what he did, and he thinks talking to me will do that. Will you go?" She looked at the letter in her hands for a moment. "Yes," she said. "But I go on my terms, on my timeline, and you come with me. If you want me there," he said. She looked up. "I do." The meeting at the minister's house was 2 days later on a Thursday afternoon. Gerald Whitmore was already there when they arrived, sitting in Reverend Caleb's front room, with a cup of tea he hadn't touched. He looked smaller than Ethan remembered, or maybe not smaller, maybe just more accurately sized, the way people look when the bluster that was adding inches to them is gone. He looked at Clara when she came in. He did not look at Ethan, which told Ethan something. "Clara," Gerald said. "Gerald," she said. She sat down. She didn't take off her coat. He looked at his hands. I owe you an apology. You owe me several, she said. Not cruel, just precise. He absorbed that. Yes, he said. I know. He looked up at her. I've been trying to save that ranch for 2 years, Clara. Your mother loved that ranch. I thought... He stopped. I told myself I was doing what was necessary. For the property. For the family. There was no family, Clara said. After Mama died, you made sure of that. Gerald flinched. He looked like he might argue, and then decided not to, which was, Ethan thought, probably the most honest thing he'd done in years. Victor Harrington told me those notes were solid, Gerald said. He told me it was a fair arrangement. He stopped. He's been playing me. I see that now. He saw a man who needed money and had something worth wanting, Clara said. That's all he ever saw. I know. Gerald's voice had gone rough. I know that now. He looked at her directly for the first time. I should not have said what I said to you about being the most useful thing. I should not have treated you the way I treated you. You are your mother's daughter, and you're... He stopped again, and this time the emotion in his voice was the real kind, the kind that doesn't clean up neatly. You are the best thing left of her, and I treated you like an asset. I am sorry for that. I am genuinely sorry. The room was very quiet. Clara sat with her hands in her lap and looked at Gerald Whitmore and said nothing for a long moment. Then she said, I know you are. Not forgiveness. Not yet, maybe not ever fully. But something, the acknowledgement that a person can be genuinely sorry for a genuinely harmful thing, and that both of those things can be true at once. Gerald let out a slow breath. The notes, Ethan said, because someone needed to move the conversation forward. Our lawyer is filing a challenge on the assignment documentation this week. If the county upholds it, 2 of the 3 notes are invalid. You'd still owe the original lender on the first one, but that's a fraction of what Harrington's been claiming. Gerald looked at him. And Harrington. Harrington's going to have to answer to the county about how those documents were filed, Ethan said. That's a legal matter. It's out of both our hands now. Gerald was quiet for a moment. What happens to the ranch? You'll probably need to sell, Ethan said. Pay the valid debt, but it'll be a proper sale at a fair price, not a foreclosure, not Harrington's terms. He paused. That's a better outcome than what you were headed for. Gerald nodded slowly. He looked at his hands again. I don't know where I go from here, he said. It wasn't self-pity, it was just an honest accounting. Neither do I, Clara said. But that's different from having no options. Gerald looked up at her one more time. Take care of yourself, Gerald, she said. She stood. She held out her hand. He stood and shook it, and the handshake was the particular handshake of a closing. The thing that marks the end of one chapter without pretending to write the next one. She walked out of the room, and Ethan followed, and she didn't look back. They rode home in the late afternoon light side by side, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. The summer air had that quality it gets in the early evening, cooler than you expect, cleaner the day's heat finally releasing. After a while, Clara said, That was harder than the sheriff. I know, Ethan said. The sheriff was just facts, she said. Gerald was... She shook her head. Gerald was something else. You did well, he said. I don't know if I forgive him, she said. I don't know if that happens or how long it takes. I don't think there's a fixed timeline, he said. No. She looked ahead. But I didn't need to. That's the thing I realized in there. I didn't need to forgive him to be done. I didn't need him to be fixed or better or sufficiently sorry. I just needed to close it. She paused. That's mine to carry forward and nobody else's. Ethan rode beside her and thought about what she'd said about her mother's husband on the day they'd talked about Gerald, that she didn't want to destroy him, just didn't want to be what he destroyed. She'd kept that, right through the hardest room. Clara, he said. She looked at him. He'd been trying to find the moment for this for 4 days, and he recognized that there was no perfect moment. There was only the moment you were in and the honest thing to say in it. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right." "When I left Callahan Ranch," he said, "I had a reason. I told you the shape of it. I needed to know if there was a person who'd treat me decently when I had nothing." He looked at her. "I found that answer in the first 4 days. I found it in you." He paused. "What I didn't expect was that finding it would matter as much as it did. That it would change things beyond the question I'd come out to ask." She was watching him carefully. "I'm not telling you this to push anything," he said. "You've had 2 weeks that would flatten most people. You're just getting your feet under you in a new place. I understand all of that." He held her gaze. "But I promised you everything back on the road. And everything includes this. I don't want you to stay at Callahan Ranch because you have nowhere else to go. I want you to stay or leave or do anything else because it's what you choose, for your own reasons." She was quiet for a long moment. "And if I choose to stay," she said, very carefully. "Then you stay," he said. "And we figure out what that means as we go. No pressure, no arrangement." He paused. "Nothing that isn't chosen freely." She looked at the road ahead. Then she said, "Mrs. Avery told me last night that the ranch's foaling records haven't been properly organized since 2014. She said it in a way that was clearly meant to tell me something." Ethan almost smiled. "That sounds like Mrs. Avery." "She also said," Clara continued, "that the North Pasture accounting has been done wrong for at least 3 seasons, and that Henry knows it but won't say so because he doesn't want to embarrass himself." She glanced at him sideways. "She said someone with a proper head for figures could fix it in a week." "She's probably right," he said. "So," Clara said, "I have reasons." He looked at her. "To stay," she said. And she said it the way she said everything that mattered, plainly, without decoration, with the full weight of it behind every word. Ethan nodded. They rode the rest of the way home in the kind of silence that doesn't need filling, and when the lights of Callahan Ranch came into view ahead of them, warm in the early dark, Clara didn't stop this time to look at it from a distance. She rode straight in like she knew the way, like she had been here before, like she was coming home. The county land office ruling came on a Friday morning 12 days after Henry had first ridden into town with the lawyer. Ethan was in the barn with Clara when Henry came back with the letter. He handed it to Ethan without a word, and Ethan looked at Clara, and Clara said, "Open it," in the voice she used when she had already braced for both outcomes and was simply waiting to find out which one had arrived. He opened it. He read it once. Then he read it again. Then he handed it to Clara. She read it standing right there in the barn doorway, with June's nose bumping gently against her shoulder. And when she finished, she looked up, and the expression on her face was not the explosion of relief that people show in stories. It was quieter than that. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just been told they can set it down, and the body doesn't know immediately how to do that, how to redistribute the weight, how to stand without the familiar burden. "Both notes," she said. "Both," Ethan confirmed. The county had ruled the assignment documentation on notes 2 and 3 invalid. Victor Harrington had no legal claim on those debts. The properties those notes had been leveraged against, including the eastern water rights section of the Whitmore land, that Harrington had really been after all along, were not his to claim. Henry was watching both of them with the quiet satisfaction of a man who has done his part of a thing correctly and is content to let others have the moment. "Gerald," Clara said. "I'll send word today," Ethan said. "He needs to know." She nodded. She looked at the letter one more time, then handed it back to him. Then she turned and pressed her forehead briefly against June's neck, just for a moment, just long enough, and the mare stood perfectly still for it, the way good horses do. "All right," Clara said when she straightened. "What happens next?" What happened next was Victor Harrington. They had known he would come. They had known it the way you know a storm is coming when the air changes 3 hours before, not certain of exactly when, but certain. He came the next morning. He came with his lawyer this time, not his ranch hands, which was a different kind of statement. His lawyer was a thin man named Caldwell, who carried a leather case and wore an expression of professional neutrality that had been applied so many times it had become structural. Ethan met them in the yard. Clara stood beside him. She had not been asked to stand there, and he had not suggested it. She had simply come out of the house when she heard the horses and taken her place next to him, and the naturalness of it, the way she moved into that position without hesitation, was something Ethan felt rather than observed. Victor looked at her first, then at Ethan. His face was composed, but the pleasantness was gone, now fully gone, and what was underneath it was something colder and more honest. "Callahan," he said. "Victor," Ethan said. "You understand this isn't over," Victor said. "The ruling can be appealed. Caldwell has already begun the paperwork." "That's his right," Ethan said. "Ethan, the water rights on the north corner of the Whitmore property are worth more than the note dispute," Victor said. He said it plainly, abandoning the pleasant framing entirely, which Ethan respected in a bleak way. At least this was the real conversation. "You know that." "I know it," Ethan said. "Then you know I'm not going away." "I know that too." Victor's eyes moved to Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I want you to understand that none of this animosity is directed at you. Whatever you believe about the arrangement I proposed, my intentions were genuine. William is a decent man." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "Mr. Harrington, your intentions don't change what the arrangement was. You discussed my future with my stepfather as a financial transaction. You talked about me in a room I was sitting in. You filed a false report with the sheriff claiming I was taken against my will." Her voice was perfectly even. "Your intentions and your actions are two different things, and I've learned to judge people by their actions." Victor held her gaze. Something moved through his face. Not remorse exactly, but the recognition of a person encountering someone who cannot be managed. He looked back at Ethan. "The appeal will take time," Ethan said. "While it proceeds, the ruling stands. You have no claim on the Whitmore water rights. You have no claim on Gerald's property beyond the first note." He paused. "And our lawyer is also preparing a filing regarding the pattern of irregular documentation across your other land acquisitions in this county." He let that land. "Not just the Whitmore notes. The others, too." Caldwell beside Victor went very still. Victor's jaw tightened for the first time, just once, a single visible crack in the composition. "That's a broad claim," he said. "Yes," Ethan agreed. "It is, because it's a broad pattern." The silence between them lasted a full 10 seconds, which is a very long time when both people in it understand exactly what is being said. Then Victor said, "You've made a significant enemy today, Callahan." "I reckon I have," Ethan said. "I've made them before." Victor turned his horse. Caldwell followed without a word. They rode down the track, and this time Ethan noticed that the pace was slightly faster than it had been on the way in. Not a retreat, but not an unhurried departure either. Henry appeared at Ethan's left shoulder. "Think he'll push the appeal?" "Yes," Ethan said. "But it'll cost him more than the water rights are worth, because he'll be doing it while our lawyer is filing on the other properties. He'll have to fight on two fronts." He watched the riders disappear around the bend in the track. He's a man who wins by making the other person think they have no options. The moment you show him you have options, his leverage disappears. Clara said quietly, "He'll try to come after Gerald instead. Gerald is still the easier target." Ethan looked at her. She was right, and she'd gotten there faster than he had. "Yes," he said. "Then we need to make sure Gerald isn't standing alone when he does," she said. She said it simply. She said it the way she said the things that cost her, not without feeling them, but without letting the feeling make her small. She had walked out of Gerald Whitmore's house 3 weeks ago, carrying a bag that wasn't big enough for everything she owned, and now she was standing in the yard of Callahan Ranch, talking about how to protect the man who'd told her to go. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "I'll ride to Gerald this afternoon," he said. "We'll ride," she said, and walked back into the house. Seg. Gerald Whitmore opened his door, looking like a man who had slept badly for 2 weeks, which was probably accurate. He looked at Clara first, and something moved through his face that wasn't quite shame, and wasn't quite relief, and lived somewhere between the two. "You didn't have to come," he said. "I know," Clara said. "That's why we're here." They sat in Gerald's kitchen. The same kitchen where 3 weeks ago his voice had risen and fallen, and finally said the words that had sent her out the door, and Ethan laid out the situation plainly. The ruling. The appeal. The likelihood that Harrington would shift his pressure toward Gerald now that the direct route was blocked. What Gerald needed to do in the next 30 days to protect himself from whatever Harrington's next move looked like. Gerald listened with the focused, humble attention of a man who has recently discovered the limits of his own understanding and is no longer pretending those limits don't exist. He asked questions, careful ones. He took notes on a scrap of paper. When Ethan finished, he sat for a moment with his hands flat on the table. "Why are you doing this?" he said. Not to Ethan, to Clara. She looked at him steadily. "Because my mother loved this land," she said. "And because you were better once, and because I'm not interested in watching Victor Harrington win." Gerald's throat moved. He looked down at the table. "I don't deserve this." "Probably not," Clara said. "But we're doing it anyway." She paused. "What you do with it is up to you." He looked up at her with the eyes of a man who is seeing someone clearly, possibly for the first time. "She'd be proud of you," he said. "Your mother." Clara held his gaze. "I know," she said, simply, without flinching, as though it were a thing she had decided to believe and had stopped needing anyone else to confirm. They rode back to Callahan Ranch in the early evening, and the ride was easier than the last time, and the silence was easier still. The appeal when Harrington filed it took 4 months. In those 4 months, Clara reorganized the Callahan Ranch foaling records going back 6 years, which took her 2 weeks and revealed 3 breeding errors that had been costing the ranch money for 3 seasons. She fixed the North Pasture accounting as promised, and found the errors Henry had buried, and told him about them in a private conversation that she described to Ethan afterward only as fine, and that Henry described to Ethan as the least embarrassing difficult conversation I've ever had about money. She learned to manage the horse trading ledger. She sat in on 2 of Ethan's meetings with potential buyers and asked questions that made the buyers take her more seriously than they'd intended to when they walked in, which Ethan found quietly satisfying every time. Mrs. Avery taught her the particular diplomacy required to manage the ranch's relationship with 3 neighboring properties, whose owners had complicated histories with Callahan land going back 15 years. Clara absorbed this information with the same complete attention she brought to everything, and in month 2, managed a water-sharing dispute with the neighboring Kellerman Ranch in a single conversation that Henry said would have taken Ethan 3 meetings and possibly 1 shouting match. "She's better at people than you are," Henry told Ethan without particular delicacy. "I know," Ethan said, "not a criticism." "I know that too." Things between Ethan and Clara moved the way things move when 2 careful people, who have both been burned by carelessness, decide without discussing it directly that they will be deliberate. They ate supper together most evenings. They rode together on Sunday mornings when the week's work permitted it. They talked, really talked the way people talk when they have both run out of interest in performing themselves and are simply being themselves, which is a different thing entirely. He told her about Callahan Mountain Ranch before it became what it was, the years of building the deals that didn't work. The winter that nearly ended it, the moment he'd realized it was real. She told him about her mother, the woman she'd been before Gerald, the way she'd laughed, the way she'd taught Clara to read a ledger when Clara was 9 years old, because she believed a woman who understood money was a woman who couldn't be taken advantage of. "She was right," Ethan said. "She was right about a lot of things," Clara said. "She was wrong about Gerald." She paused. "Or maybe she was right about who he was at the time, and then he changed. I've stopped trying to figure out which one it was." "That sounds like wisdom." "That sounds like exhaustion," she said. "But maybe they look the same from the outside. He laughed. She did too. And that small moment of laughter at the kitchen table at 9 o'clock at night with the lamp between them was the moment Ethan thought, there it is. There is the thing I came out looking for and found in the wrong place, because I was looking for someone who would treat me decently when I had nothing, and what I found was someone who treats every person decently regardless, and that is a much rarer and more valuable thing. Yeah. The appeal ruling came on a Wednesday in November, 4 months after Harrington filed it. Ethan was in town when word came. He was at the lawyer's office, going over the parallel filing on Harrington's other property acquisitions, which had expanded in scope over the previous 3 months, as the county records clerk, who turned out to have been quietly documenting irregularities for 2 years, waiting for someone to ask, provided documentation that went considerably beyond the Whitmore notes. The lawyer put the county's written decision on the desk between them. Appeal denied. Harrington's claim on notes 2 and 3 stood invalidated. The water rights on the North Whitmore property were not his. And effective the same ruling, the county had opened a formal inquiry into 5 additional Harrington property acquisitions going back 7 years. Ethan read the document twice. Then he rode home faster than he'd ridden anywhere in months. Clara was with Henry at the barn when Ethan came through the gate, and Henry took one look at his face and said, "Good news," the way a man says something he already knows. "Very," Ethan said. Clara turned. She looked at him, and she read his face the way she read everything quickly, completely not missing anything. "It held," she said. "It held," he confirmed. "And Harrington has a formal county inquiry into 5 other acquisitions." He stepped down from Cinder. It's not over for him. He'll have lawyers fighting this for years, but he is not going to be building his empire in this county unchallenged anymore. He looked at her directly. He doesn't have the water rights. Gerald keeps whatever he can salvage from the property, and Harrington is going to spend the next several years explaining his paperwork to people with the authority to demand answers. Clara stood very still. Then she sat down on the fence rail. Not collapsed, just sat. The way you sit when your legs have decided that standing was adequate to the previous version of the situation, and this new version requires a different response. Henry quietly took Cinder's reins and led her away. Ethan came and stood in front of Clara. She looked up at him. In her face he saw something he had never quite seen there before. Not the composure, not the measuring look, not the controlled steadiness she wore like armor. Something underneath all of that. Something that had been there the whole time, waiting for a moment to be safe enough to show itself. "It's done," she said. "The legal part," he said. "Yes. Gerald is safe. For now, as safe as Gerald gets." She nodded. She looked at her hands for a moment. Then she said, "I didn't cry when I walked out of Gerald's house. I didn't have room for it then. I was too busy figuring out what to do next." She paused. "I don't think I've had room for it since." "You've got room now," he said. "If you need it." She looked up at him, and then Clara Whitmore, who had not cried in front of a living person since her mother's funeral 4 years ago, who had learned to keep her grief private, because private was the only place it was safe, who had run the accounts and fixed the fences and brought breakfast to strangers and said no to the men who tried to sell her future, and walked out the door with a bag that wasn't big enough. Clara let out one long, shaking breath, and her eyes filled, and she pressed her hand to her mouth for a moment. Ethan sat down on the fence rail beside her. He didn't say anything. He didn't try to fix it, or move past it, or reframe it. He just sat there close enough that she wasn't alone in it, and let her have it. She cried for about 3 minutes. Quietly, not dramatically the way people cry when they've been waiting a long time and have only just found the space. Then she wiped her face with the back of her hand and let out another breath, and she was Clara again, steady, clear present. "Sorry," she said. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "Don't apologize for that," he said. "Not to me." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded once, accepting this. 2 weeks later, on a Saturday evening in November, when the first cold had come down from the ridge and Mrs. Avery had made a fire in the main room and then conspicuously taken herself to bed early. Ethan sat across from Clara at the kitchen table and told her the rest of the truth. Not the facts she had, all the facts. He told her the part underneath the facts. When I left this ranch in July, he said, I thought I was looking for proof that decent people existed. That was what I told myself. He looked at the table. What I understand now looking back is that I was also looking for a reason to believe any of it mattered. The ranch, the work, the life I'd built. He looked up at her. It's easy to build things when you have the resources to build them. The question I couldn't answer was whether any of it meant anything if there was no one to build it for. Clara listened with her hands folded on the table, perfectly still. I found the answer to the first question in the first week, he said. You answered it without knowing you were answering anything. He paused. The second question took longer. Because the answer to the second question isn't a thing you find. It's a thing that happens. Slowly over meals and ledgers and fence posts and terrible rides through the July heat. He held her gaze. And I know you've been through more in the past 4 months than most people go through in years. I know this isn't the time or the setting that anyone would choose for this kind of conversation. But I promised you everything, and everything includes this. He stopped. Clara said, Keep going. He took a breath. I'm not asking you to be here because you have nowhere else to go, he said. I'm asking you to consider when you're ready on your own timeline, no pressure and no arrangement, whether you might want to be here because you choose to be. He paused. Permanently. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved along the ridge. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Ethan, she said. Yes. I reorganized your foaling records, she said. I fixed Henry's accounting. I renegotiated the Kellerman water dispute. I've been here 4 months, and I know where every fence line on this property runs. She held his gaze. I didn't do any of that, because I had nowhere else to go. He looked at her. I did it, she said, because it needed doing, and because she stopped. Something moved through her face, the particular expression of a person saying a true thing out loud for the first time. Because this is the first place in my life where the work I do is seen. Where I am seen. She looked at her hands for a moment, then back at him. You stood in the yard, she said, on a day when no one had ever stood in the yard for me. And you have been standing there in one way or another, every day since. She paused. I don't need to be asked twice. The quiet between them after that was the best kind. The kind that isn't empty, but full of the specific weight of two people who have both traveled a long way to get to the same place and have finally arrived. Clara, he said. Yes, she said, before he could finish, because she already knew, and she was done waiting. Tid. They married in the spring on a Saturday in May in the yard of Callahan Ranch, with Reverend Caleb presiding, and Henry standing up for Ethan, and Mrs. Avery crying in a way she would later describe as allergies, in front of approximately 40 people from Clover Creek, who had all in varying degrees underestimated Clara Whitmore at one point or another, and were now revising their assessments. Clem was there, clean-shirted and uncomfortable, in the way of young men at formal occasions. Earl Briggs from the general store, who had told Ethan about the Whitmore ranch back in July, stood near the back with his wife and looked like a man trying to calculate his own small role in a story that had turned out larger than he'd expected. Sheriff Pruitt stood near the front. He had, over the preceding months, overseen the county inquiry into Harrington's acquisitions with the deliberate, unhurried thoroughness that characterized everything he did, and the inquiry had produced results that changed the shape of land ownership in 3 counties. He nodded at Clara when she came out of the house, and she nodded back, and the acknowledgement between them was the acknowledgement of 2 people who had done difficult things correctly and knew it. Gerald Whitmore was there. He stood at the back, hat in hand, and he did not try to sit at the front or claim a prominence he hadn't earned. Clara had invited him because he was her mother's husband, and because she had decided, not forgiven, not yet fully, but decided that she would not build her new life on the architecture of her old bitterness. He was there, and he was quiet, and when she walked past him, she paused for just a moment and put her hand briefly on his arm. And that was all. And it was enough. Victor Harrington was not there. Victor Harrington was on that particular Saturday in May, in the county seat, dealing with the ongoing legal consequences of 7 years of improperly documented property acquisitions, which was where he would be on and off for the next several years. His plans for the Whitmore water rights for the spring on the north corner that fed into his land, for the expansion of his empire into the hill country north of Clover Creek, all of it had stalled in the way that plans stall when built on paper that doesn't hold. He was not ruined. Men like Harrington are rarely ruined completely. But he was checked, and he was accountable, and the county knew his name in a different way than it had before, and that was a meaningful change in the shape of things. The summer after the wedding, Clara started something that had not existed before on Callahan Ranch. She called it without any particular ceremony, simply the open door. It had started with a woman from town, a widow named Frances, left with a small ranch and no knowledge of how to run it, who had come to Clara, not because Clara was Ethan Callahan's wife, but because word had gotten around Clover Creek that Clara Whitmore. Clara Callahan now understood land and money and was willing to sit with a person and explain things without making them feel foolish for not knowing. Clara sat with Frances for 2 afternoons and went through her accounts with her and showed her what was working and what wasn't and what to ask a buyer and what to refuse. Frances told 2 friends. Those 2 friends told others. By the end of that first summer, Clara had sat with 11 women from the surrounding area. Some widows, some daughters of struggling ranchers, some simply women who had been managing their families' finances in the dark, because no one had ever thought to show them how, and worked through their books with them, answered their questions, helped them understand what they had and what it was worth. She did not charge for it. Ethan watched this happen with the particular quiet satisfaction of a man watching something grow that nobody planned. "You know what you're building," he said to her one evening. "I know what I'm doing," she said. "Whether it's building something is up to them." "What would you call it?" She thought about it. "My mother said a woman who understands money can't be taken advantage of," she said. I think she meant it about individual women. But I've been thinking, if enough women in the same county understand their own books, understand land law, understand what their signatures mean and what they're worth. She paused. "That's not one woman protected. That's a different county." Ethan looked at her. He thought about a woman kneeling in the dirt beside a broken fence post on a July morning retying cord that wasn't going to hold, absorbing one more thing going wrong with a breath through her nose and no one watching. He thought that woman was always here. This was always in her. It just needed a place where it was safe to grow. "Then build it," he said. She looked at him. "I intend to," she said. Years later, people in Clover Creek and the surrounding counties would describe Callahan Ranch the way people describe places that have become something more than what they started as, not in grand terms, not in the language of monuments, but in the specific concrete language of what actually happened there. The place where Clara Callahan kept the open door. The place where a woman could come with her account books and her confusion and her fear of being taken advantage of and leave with the knowledge to protect herself. The place where Henry Walsh finally got his accounting right with considerable assistance and never mentioned it again. The place where June the roan mare lived to 22 years old and was treated until her last day like the finest horse on the property, which by most accounts she was. The place where Ethan Callahan, who had ridden out one July morning in a sun-bleached shirt and cracked boots with $40 and a borrowed name, had found what he'd gone looking for in the last place he'd expected. Not in the proof that decent people existed, but in the specific, irreplaceable face of one of them. And Clara Callahan, who had been told in 100 different ways, by 100 different silences, that she was the most useful thing, and not a person worth seeing. Clara was seen. Every day. without condition, without arrangement, without anyone deciding what she was worth and whether she'd earned it. She was seen because she was there, and she was there because she chose to be, and she had chosen because she was a woman who, when finally given a real choice, knew exactly what she wanted. She had always known. She had just needed someone to stand in the yard long enough for her to say so. And that is the whole truth of it, that sometimes the person who has walked away from everything is the one who finally shows you what everything is for. That a home is not land or money or a name on a deed. A home is the place where someone looked at you, really looked past the usefulness and the circumstances and the position you were born into and said, I see you. I choose you. Not because of what you have or what you can provide or what problem you solve, just you. That is what Ethan Callahan went looking for in the summer of 1887, riding into a small town with a borrowed name and cracked boots and $40. And that is exactly what he found.